Hey there, folks. It's Zach Elliott over at Feel Free to Argue. Wanted to talk a little bit this morning about voter suppression and voter fraud. And hearing a lot about Acorn lately. And I think it's actually really interesting that there's so much attention being paid to these registrations that have been made out for Mickey Mouse, or in one case for the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. I guess all of them, but not individually identified by names. And I think what we need to be aware of in this situation is that there is a countrywide attempt to suppress votes. And it is being justified on the basis of this horrible wave of voter fraud. And I think it's important to be aware of what has been proven and what has not been proven. At this point, I think it's definitely been established that Acorn has screwed up a few times. That they've definitely turned in some registrations for people who don't exist. And it's because they've been taking advantage of the fact that they have temporary employees who they're paying $8 an hour, and they told them to go out and get registrations, and some of them were lazy and they cheated and they just wrote down whatever name. They walked by a Jimmy John's and it's like, oh, okay, Jimmy John's is going to vote. But that's the important thing to be aware of. Jimmy John's is not going to vote. As many Acorn employees as they want can put down that Jimmy John's is going to vote, but Jimmy John's is not going to come to vote. And the reason for that is actually really simple, and that's because it's a federal offense to try to vote more than once or to vote illegally. The criminal penalties for voter fraud are really, really horrific. They're as serious as our regulations for, say, white-collar crime should be. And I think this is where you get into the real problem of this strategy of trying to require people to have all kinds of identification and all these attempts to scrub voter rolls. The Republicans seem to be operating, and I don't mean to cast this actually as being an exclusively Republican issue, because certainly in the past, in the distant past, certainly the Democrats were every bit as complicit in terms of voter suppression. And even recently, as recently as the last election, you have Greg Palast reporting about how Richardson actually did nothing to combat what was clearly voter suppression in New Mexico's last primary. And Palast reports about this extensively in Armed Madhouse. So if any of you think that Richardson is a good guy, I really advise you to read Palast's sections about New Mexico in the last election in Armed Madhouse, because the Democrats certainly, certainly historically, but even recently, have been part of the problem. But still, I think it's fair to say, like a lot of problems, that if both parties are responsible for this problem, then still the Republicans are clearly more so. Then if you look at all the stuff with the U.S. attorneys, a lot of these people, this is the exact thing that they were fired for, because they were told, and they were given this as a priority, and they were given lots of pressure about it, to find examples of voter fraud so that they could justify the Republican vote suppression techniques. Because one of the main problems that they have with this right now is that they want to keep people from voting, and most people think that this is a fairly serious thing, that people should be able to vote. And so in order to accept these once again, largely Republican ideas about who should and shouldn't vote, they need to establish that there's an actual problem that they're solving for. And this is where they start to get into some real trouble. I remember seeing this interview with someone who was arguing for one of these laws in Indiana, one of these voter ID laws. And, just going on and on about how, oh, we need this, this is a terrible menace, and we don't want people to be elected on falsely with all these, fake registrations and stuff. So they said, okay, well, how many proven cases, how many people have actually been convicted of voter fraud? And it was like one person 30 years ago. So, and what people need to get their heads around is that when you have one of these things that calls for voter identification, or you have a voter purge of the rolls, that essentially when you do that, you are going to prevent thousands, tens of thousands, I suppose if the state is large enough, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of people who should be able to vote and who have done nothing wrong, you're going to prevent them from voting. It's a fact. It's a fact that you are going to prevent lots and lots of people from voting. Now, you can make all kinds of justifications about that, but this is the actual fact of the matter. When you tell someone that they have to present a license, well, who is more likely to have a license? Middle-class white people. Who is less likely to have a license? The old, the poor, minorities are overwhelmingly more likely to not have a license. So there should be no question in anybody's mind what all these things are intended to do. I mean, they're meant to disenfranchise the poor. And the problem is that, I would be upset if I thought that that our elections were being stolen by masses of people who were voting illegally. I would be upset about that. And I would be upset whether it meant the Democrats were winning or the Republicans were winning. I would be upset if either side had this unfair advantage. But the fact is that nobody has an unfair advantage. There is no actual problem. I mean, I urge you to research this yourself. Research and see how many people have actually been convicted of voter fraud, and how many votes this represents, and whether or not this would have swayed any elections. And I think what you will find is that we have this enormous, unwieldy, inaccurate solution that's being proposed to essentially what is a non-existent problem. So, once again, this is something where I urge everybody to do their own research, to think about it, and think about also, where are you going to find all these people who are willing to engage in this federal offense? And I mean, how many people do you need for it to be meaningful in any state? I mean, let's just assume, for example, that Acorn is actually trying to illegally sway the election. And there's a lot of reasons why this is stupid. One, it's a national organization. Two, they're publicizing their efforts. Three, they frequently turn in these wrong registrations themselves. There's all kinds of reasons why this would be the absolute worst way to go about this, even if this was what you were trying to do. So, like a lot of aspects of politics right now, it's just something that absolutely does not make any sense if you think about it. But hey, this is Zach Elliott, and you can certainly feel free to argue.